Welcome to DynamicsCon. Glad to have you here. I am Mark Polino. I'm the Director of Customer Success with FastPath, and we are going to do 40 security tips for Dynamics GP today. These are going to be really fast. They are practical tips that you can take back and that you can use tomorrow in your organization. So we have lots of great stuff here. 40 tips in 40 minutes is really fast, so there's a chat open. You can ask live questions in the chat. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through, but I don't have a lot of time, so we're going to get rolling here. All right, for our program agenda, we've got a whole bunch of different security-related items, settings, setup pieces, processes, mitigations, and then some principles to get you pointed in the right direction. First up with security settings, item number one is simply make sure that company security is on. So inside of FastPath, under Setup Company, there's actually a checkbox to turn on company security. I don't know why it's there, but if you turn it off, then anybody can do anything they want inside of GP, and that's really not where you want to be. So once you've turned that item on, you get that security is activated. For most of you, this is going to be on, but it doesn't hurt to double check that. Number two, restrict access to the company setup window. This is the same window where security is set. You don't want folks to be able to come to this window and turn off security and do something inappropriate. So you want to make sure that in security roles that access to the company setup window is restricted. Number three, only set security with organizational structures. So we're going to hop back one here. Next to the red arrow marked security, right below that, there's an item called account security. And some people think, well, if security is good, I should turn that on. I should also turn on account security. But here in tip number three, if you turn on account security and you've not gone and set up organizational structures, account security restricts access to the chart of accounts. So when you flip that account security switch, if this has not been set up, all of your users will appear to be gone. It will look as though they've all been removed. And the only person who can access, it will look like the chart of accounts has been removed. And the only user who can access the chart of accounts is SA. So it's really easy to get that all back. Just uncheck the box for organizational security or set up organizational structures and give folks specific access to parts of the chart of accounts. But checking that box and not knowing what it does can be a career limiting move. So I'm going to encourage you to do any testing with that before you actually flip that switch. Number four, eliminate multiple access options. So in GP, there are lots of different ways to do something. So for example, if we're looking at ways to do a journal entry, there's actually three. You can do a clearing entry, you can do a quick journal entry, or you can do a transaction entry. Most organizations don't actually use clearing or quick journals, and the functionality in clearing and quick journals has now been rolled into batch functionality for a transaction entry. So for most companies, one way to be safer is to simply turn off clearing and quick journals. And that way you're funneling everyone through a transaction entry if they're trying to do a journal entry, and that gives you better control. Additionally, transaction entry supports batching, it supports approvals, it supports reviews of those batches, those kinds of things. Clearing and quick journals do not. But we're not just focused on journal entry here. There are three ways to process an AP invoice. There's a number of other things in GP. These are just a couple of examples that have multiple ways to process a transaction. We would recommend you figure out the right way for your organization, for most people, and then slim that down to just that access for most people. Number five, this is something a lot of people don't know. You can grant access to a journal entry, let people enter journal entries, print reports on journal entries, but restrict their ability to post an entry. So when you're setting up security, in the security task box, if you change the type to series posting permission, then you can actually control the individual posting pieces. So you can allow someone to make changes to a piece, but not allow them to post. All right, let's look at a few security setup pieces here. So a big one is to minimize the use of the SA user. The SA user is a powerful user. It goes beyond just GP. It grants access to all of SQL Server. And SA is effectively anonymous in the sense that if you give it to multiple people, there's no easy way to tell which person used that login. It also technically isn't required for GP. It might be required for some third parties, but the GP team has worked really hard to remove the requirement for SA. The big plus is it does make install consistent. So if you're installing GP for the first time, feel free to use SA. But SA is not required to make changes. So you really want to minimize the use of SA in your environment. And as part of that, there are ways to use a different user to manage adding users and manage security in GP. So the graphic to the right here that has options, this is from Microsoft's GP Planning for Security, page 35. These are 5 different ways that you can manage users and security in GP. Some of them, number 1 is use SA. But number 3, number 4, number 5, ways to get around that. Number 2, actually 2, 4, and 5 are really the best ways to get around that, where you actually have a named user, a user inside of GP who can make changes. Number 7, remove SA when it's used for connections. This is another part of minimizing SA. This is often used, folks have a third-party application that they use. Maybe it's for uploading information, maybe integrations, maybe it's for something else. And when they did the setup, they needed to connect to the GP database, and they used the SA account. SA works great for this. The problem is if you want to change the SA password, and you should change it periodically, it can be difficult to trace what applications are using this. One option to do this is to change the SA password, figure out what breaks, and then reset it back, and then go and fix those particular connections. It is possible to do some SQL tracing to figure out what's actually using those connections, but it's not the easiest thing either. So there are a couple of methods, but none of them are simple. Ideally, though, you want to remove that because you are going to want to change that SA password periodically. Maybe an administrator leaves and you're going to want to really restrict who has access, especially system administrator access to your database. Number 8, as part of this, the DynSA user is also used by some folks to manage users in GP. It is not required to manage users in GP. It is required to be present as the owner of every GP database. So that is a requirement. You can't actually remove the DynSA user. It is not required to be a power user. It's not required to add users. It's not required to have special permissions, etc. So our recommendation is set a DynSA password, use something complex from a password generator, and then lose it. You can always use SA to change it if you need it, but it's a powerful, relatively anonymous login, especially if you've granted power user and other things to it. So we would recommend that you just set a password and then lose the password. Number 9, assign GP users to add and remove users from security. We talked a little bit about this in tip number 6, but I just want to emphasize it here. So we've got a blog post on this. We've got a white paper on how to make all of this happen. It includes the language from Microsoft, but I just want to emphasize that with this option, the Dynamics GP Administrator can be any user account in GP. So that's a quote from Planning for Security. There are a lot of myths out there about this. There are a lot of myths that say you must use SA or you must use DynSA. It is not required. And related to that, we get a lot of auditors who want the SA and DynSA user minimized, so it's an important piece. Number 10, don't rely on the included roles. GP has a number of roles and tasks. So for example, in the graphic on the right, we're looking at the bookkeeper role. The included roles don't support segregation of duties. They don't support best practices with respect to securing your system, and they are written by software programmers. They're not written by accounting teams or security teams or anything like that. It's not a knock on Microsoft. The vast majority of applications we work with do the exact same thing. What that means is an AP role has access to do just about everything in AP. In the case of this bookkeeper role, they have access to maintain the chart of accounts, add vendors, process transactions, manage bank recs. They could literally process a transaction from beginning to end, finish the bank rec, and hide an illicit transaction. So we would recommend not relying on the included roles. Instead, a better option is to leverage the existing tasks. They're not perfect, but they will get you 90% of the way there. It's a lot better than relying on the existing roles. So build new roles with the existing tasks. We've got a GP security matrix that can help with this. This is completely free. It's a spreadsheet. It has the existing tasks in it. And then you simply lay out what you want your new roles to be and make X's of what you want to be in those roles. It's essentially a graphic way of designing new roles so that you can get a better visual of really what people have access to. Again, completely free, just to download. Number 12, GP has some other licenses that restrict access. So leverage those limited and self-serve licenses. They have inherent security controls in that they limit you to particular items. So for example, if someone has a self-service license, there is no way for me to grant them the ability to change the chart of account or add a vendor or something along those lines. So especially if your users don't need access to everything, in addition to saving you some money by using a lower license, you also get improved security. Number 13, eliminate the power user role. Power user is not a traditional role in that you're not checking boxes to give people access. It is an override. It grants access to everything. So because it doesn't grant explicit permission to things, it is not included in security reporting. The security report essentially says, show me all of the folks who have a security box checked that allow access to something. And power user does not have any security boxes checked next to it. The system has coding behind the scenes to say if power user is checked, they just skip security and let the user do anything. So because of this, it can create some problems when you start talking about audits or management wanting to know who has access to things. You might say, this is my list of users who can create a customer. If you've not included power users in that list, or if you've not produced a separate list of power users, then you don't have a complete list of everyone with access. That can create issues. It can create trust issues when you're saying, this is everyone who can do this item, and then someone does a little tracing and finds power users that have been doing that particular item as well. So power users not required. There are very few people in the world who need to both create a vendor and fix some type of setup issue inside of GP. Also, all of these advanced roles, power user, SA, DynSA, they can all be very dangerous. Folks can accidentally stumble into areas of the system and break things. We've seen lots of cases where significant damage was done non-maliciously. It was just a simple error. User went someplace and said, what did this do? And it did something bad. So we would recommend granting the security people need rather than using a power user role. 14, you want to restrict tools. I love the tools inside of GP, things like the professional services tools library, combiners, modifiers. They're fantastic. They will save your bacon sometimes when you need to combine vendors or customers, modify items in the chart of accounts, all those kinds of things. But they're also a sneaky backdoor way to make changes. So we would recommend restricting them to specific users. They are a backdoor way to create, hide, change, or otherwise manipulate things like vendors and customers, the chart of accounts. For example, if someone had created an inappropriate vendor, maybe something named very close to a real vendor, if they wanted to hide that at some point, they could merge that into an existing vendor. All of the transactions would be merged into the existing vendor. It would make it much more difficult to understand that there had been a fake vendor out there for a while. So again, restrict those tools to people who really need them. Number 15, this is a big tip. If you can separate master records from transactions in your organization. So this is a segregation of duties tip. If you can do that, you will be ahead of most of the companies that are out there. So if you can say folks who can create vendors can't also generate invoices and payments, if you can say folks who create customers can't generate invoices, folks who can change fiscal periods are not allowed to produce journal entries, those kinds of things, you will be significantly more secure than your neighbor organization down the street. That one is often relatively easy for companies to accomplish. Related to that, if you can separate multi-part transactions, so separate invoicing from payments, payment application, separate customer receipts from write-offs, this is that next level of really helping to prevent fraud inside of your organization. Number 17, don't over-provision for inquiry. I see this occasionally. The inquiry windows in GP can be a little bit different from the entry windows. An example is the vendor window has a couple of extra fields, and I've seen cases where someone successfully argued that they should have the entire vendor window that they just needed to look at instead of an inquiry window. That's usually a trap. Granting someone access that allows changes when all they need is the ability to view is a bad idea. If particular fields are not available, like the vendor window in an inquiry window, give them a smart list instead. Smart list has access to all of the fields in that window. It's a little different presentation, but this isn't about presentation. It's about them being able to see the data that they need. Smart list works just fine. Provision backups only as needed. This is a little bit of a foreign concept to folks. In many cases, we see maybe there's a primary person and then a backup person, and both of them have access to do a task all year long, when in fact the backup person only needs it for a couple of weeks while the primary person is on vacation. You don't necessarily give your dog walker keys to your house and expect them to be able to come in and out anytime they want throughout the year, especially if it's just your dog walker for vacation. So you would give them those keys, and then when you're back from vacation, you take those keys back. Same process for backups. You're better off having a really robust process to provision that backup access and then take it away. So for example, IT knows when the payroll person is out. They know exactly what to do to provision payroll access. They know who to give it to. It's a 5-minute process and your backup person is up and running, versus maybe having a payroll backup available all year long in a way that they might be able to do something unexpected. Number 19, there's an option to let users log in with Active Directory. So this one is a paid option. There is no free option. Microsoft has said they're never going to allow it. It's a FastPath product. You're big boys and girls. You understand whether or not it's appropriate for you and your organization to spend money for something. So simply knowing that that option is available is often important. So there is an option to let users log in with Active Directory. They sign in with AD, they click the GP icon, and we pass the credentials through and log them in directly to GP. Number 20, remove unnecessary roles. So the idea here is if there are roles you are not using, you want to go ahead and remove those from GP to prevent accidental assignment. We talked a little bit about the danger of, for example, the bookkeeper role. So if you've provisioned your users, you're happy with it, go ahead and remove that bookkeeper role so that someone down the line doesn't go and add someone to it when you're not expecting it to. At that point, then you've over-provisioned users and it starts to get dangerous. Number 21, find and control related windows. We've talked about things like vendors and customers, but there are typically related windows as well. So when you're controlling that, you want to try to get them all. An example here would be not just controlling access to the vendor window, but to the vendor address window. You don't want people to redirect payments to a different address. And then electronic address as well. You don't want people to redirect electronic payments to a different bank account. So it's more than just restricting that primary record. You want to restrict those related windows also. Okay, let's change gears a little and talk about some processes that can improve security. One is really don't make increased access persistent. Have a plan to take away access. Maybe someone is out unexpectedly, and so we give them increased access. Often companies forget to take that away. And so someone's access builds up over time. and eventually they have access to essentially everything in GP. So there's a couple of ways to do that. You can use the task functionality in GP to remind yourself to remove that access 2 weeks later, or whatever time frame it needs to be, or you can set up an appointment in Outlook to do that. But either way, you need a plan to increase access. Number 23, don't rely on the system password. The system password is optional. It is in company setup. It is a shared password, so there's one system password that everyone would use, and it's used to access sensitive items. So I want to be clear with this. The user has to have access to the sensitive items anyway. The role that they are granted has to have access to a sensitive item. So then that would let them get to the menu and get to the window. Before the window is available to them, then the system password would pop up as an additional level of security. It is a secondary, not a primary level of security. The system password is encrypted, but it is very easily broken. It technically meets the definition of encryption. It's not quite A=1, B=2, but it's very close to that. The encryption mechanism is easily available on the internet. I have an example here of a just stupidly simple customization I wrote that'll reveal the system password. So it's something, if you have it, feel free to have it, but don't feel like I can grant excessive access to sensitive areas, adding users, company setup, those kinds of things, and not worry about it because I haven't given out the system password. Again, it's a shared password. It gets shared pretty easily. You're also going to want to change it pretty regularly. Where the system password is not required, so you could choose not to use it, you're really not going to hurt anything. Functional passwords can be very useful in certain areas, but they are also easily shared. They're not encrypted. They're stored in the database in plain text. So someone could go potentially and run a smart list report or run a smart list builder, smart list designer report and uncover those passwords, but they might be necessary. They're often used for things like exceeding a credit limit, maximum write-offs, waiving finance charges, for example. A couple of examples there. So you're going to want to change them pretty regularly, and even though they're shared, you're going to want to really restrict who gets them, and then as you change them, only share them with that small group of folks that actually need them. Related to that, regularly reset, so that's what we were talking about, because they are shared and they are easy to access. Number 26, have a process to provision users. When you create a new user, in many cases, folks just send an email and they say, I have a new user. Normally that does not have enough detail. It doesn't have what roles are required, may not have the appropriate approvals, those sorts of things. And in many cases we get, we just want you to copy access from the user who just left. And people forget that the user who just left has been there for 15 years. They've done 5 different jobs in the organization and no one ever removed access from them. So we would encourage you to have a more positive, more robust process to say this user really needs to have access to these specific roles and have approvals for that. It's okay if that's going through email, but you're going to need that level of detail to really appropriately provision users, or you risk having users with way too much access. Number 27, sometimes you got to get creative and redesign some processes. So a process can often accommodate for a lack of personnel. Many companies say we're a very small company. We don't have room for segregation of duties. So I've got a couple of process examples for you. Instead of AP entering vendors and then entering the invoice to be paid, let AP enter customers. And let AR enter vendors. In many cases, the volume is pretty close. And if not, you can typically figure out how to rebalance those around a little bit. But since AP enters customers, they're going to ask different questions. They don't deal with customers on a regular basis. And it really opens up some other issues in the process when that happens. And then with an AR team entering vendors, same type of questions come up, same type of improvements can come out of that. But now your AP team is only entering invoices. They're not responsible for managing the vendors as well. And that helps prevent problems like someone setting up their brother-in-law as a vendor and then generating improper payments. Additionally, it can be helpful if you've got a dedicated person who maybe they're an accountant, so they're really not managing customers and vendors and those types of things. If you can get a dedicated person to handle master record changes like chart of accounts, fiscal periods, maybe this is someone who approves journal entries but doesn't actually enter journal entries, that's a fantastic place to be. You have someone with the ability for all of those master record pieces. You have another person to actually do transactions. That's the type of separation you want. Number 28, we talked briefly about this, but always report on power users. There is a report, a security role assignment report for power users, and it'll give you a list of all of those folks. You can also do something in Smart List Designer to be able to get at the users who are power users. This is one of those things that just trips people up. So as you're doing your security reporting, make sure that you pull a power user report. Additionally, make sure that you secure more than just GP. GP is usually the hub of an ecosystem. You have SSRS reports that may be being generated. You may have Management Reporter or FRX or something else that you're using to generate your financial statements. You have direct access to SQL Server potentially for other kinds of reporting. You may have integration tools. You may have third parties that plug into GP differently. They may be pulling data from GP instead of being dexterity based and plugging directly into GP. Many of these tools can affect either transactions in GP or the output of financial statements, all of which can negatively impact your business. So you want to take a look at that entire ecosystem, not necessarily just Dynamics GP. This process of fixing your security is often overwhelming to folks. We would strongly recommend phase your security changes. So if your security is a mess today, and we get people who come to us and say, my security is just a mess, pick a risky area for your organization. Cash, GL, AP, doesn't matter. If everything's a mess right now, great. You're not going to fix it all overnight. Pick one thing to fix. Maybe you're going to fix general ledger, or you're going to fix your accounts payable process, and get security fixed for just that area. Yes, the other parts of the organization are still a mess when that's done, but they were a mess a week ago. But that one area you selected, maybe AP, it's a whole lot better. And then move on to the next piece and just do this as a series of short projects. And it doesn't take that long before you're halfway done and your riskiest areas are all taken care of. So you might be 50% done, but you might also be 80% safer because those areas most at risk have all been addressed. Really emphasize small wins. Small projects are easier to support. When you start making changes to security, you're probably changing a much smaller group of people. So if you do something wrong, it's easier to fix. You're not impacting the whole organization. You want those small wins to really make this happen right. Number 31. So finding segregation of duties conflicts is an important part of any security process. Every auditor, everybody who works with security will tell you that there's a long history of segregation of duties being a primary defense against inappropriate things happening in any system. We've talked about some examples like separating master records and transactions. Essentially, you're finding security settings that should not be assigned together because of the risk that comes with those items being available to the same person, vendors and payments, fiscal periods and GLs, etc. The basic stuff like those, really easy to find, the top 8 or 10, pretty straightforward, but this is hard to do without a tool. There are a lot of lists of segregation of duties out there. They come from accounting firms and other places, but none of them go down to the nitty-gritty level of an accounting system. They'll tell you you shouldn't be able to access a vendor and generate a payment, but they won't tell you you shouldn't have access to the vendor maintenance window, the vendor address window, or the vendor electronic funds transfer address window, and you shouldn't have access to the select checks window, to the check payment window, etc. So that's why in any given system, this is pretty difficult to do without a tool. You can do some of it. You can maybe do at least your top 10 with a spreadsheet and some time there. FastPath does make a tool for this. But this is an important piece, and we would encourage you to really think hard about how you might address segregation of duties conflicts. All right, let's talk about some mitigating controls. A mitigating control reduces risk outside of system security. So in areas where you can't effectively set security, I can't eliminate someone's access to a vendor and a payment, or to a customer and a refund, for example, or a customer and the customer payment. You would use a compensating control or a mitigating control to reduce that risk. So some examples that are available in GP are workflows. GP has robust workflow functionality. And in that case, you could put a workflow in a process so that someone has to approve part of that process. You're inserting a segregation of duties, so you're inserting an approval there. Maybe someone has to approve the addition of a vendor to know that you're getting legitimate vendors. And in that case, you would build a workflow around vendors. You'd have someone to review it and approve it. And then you might also have reviews and approvals on payments. So a couple of different things that you're putting in place to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. One thing about mitigating controls, it is important to ensure they're being performed. So if you say someone is going to print out a list of items due to be paid and they're going to review it and approve it, they actually have to print out the list, they have to review it, they need to sign off on it to ensure that that's actually being done. Otherwise, a mitigating control isn't really working as designed. Field level security also works well. In GP, you can restrict access to specific fields. It's maybe not exactly what you expect it to be. There are some little quirks with getting it to work right. So you are building that access to security. You definitely want to test it. This is one that takes a little work to get right, but absolutely field level security is a great choice for mitigations. We would also recommend that you buy a real Audit Trail tool. There's a tool in GP that isn't really an Audit Trail tool. It tells you that something changed, but it doesn't tell you the old value and the new value. So figuring out whether a change was appropriate doesn't really work for that. So really what you want to know is who changed what, when did it change, via what tool, what was the old value, and what was the new value. There are a number of Audit Trail tools available out there. FastPath has one, Rockton has one. There's a couple of others. We would just encourage you, buy somebody's real Audit Trail tool to be able to understand what changes are going on inside of your system. 35, perform regular access reviews. Study that came out last year said 1 in 4 employees say they still had access to accounts from past jobs. So part of an access review is you're going to look at users and the roles they have access to. You're going to confirm, are all of these the right users? Do they still work here? Should they still have access to GP? And then are these the roles that they should have access to? Should really be doing that at least annually. Number 36, some companies don't use workflows or they use them in different ways, but remember that GP does have old school approvals that have been in the product for a long time. They can be a little clunky in some cases, but they do work. And just a reminder, these do use shared passwords too. So as people approve, you're going to want to periodically change those shared passwords. The good news is GP does capture who did the approval. Number 37, this is a special workflow. So there's a workflow for approving new users to Dynamics GP. This isn't really full user provisioning, but we think this is a great step in the right direction. So before a user can be added to GP, they actually go through an approval process and get approved by someone. We would really encourage you to use this. Number 38, role workflow is also there. So if someone wants to make a change to a role, to the tasks that are in a role, you can put that through an approval workflow. This is a sneaky backdoor way to give people extra access. If I take a role that someone already has and I add additional pieces to it, nothing's really changed from that user's point of view in that they have the same role, but now that role can do a whole lot more. So we would really encourage using the role workflow. All right, just a couple of principles to get us out of here. Take a risk-based approach. When you start looking at this, things get really overwhelming. And so we would encourage you to step back and look at where the risks are in your organization. Do you have inventory risks because you sell expensive products? Or do you maybe not have inventory risk because you sell a lot of nuts and bolts? And so if someone walked out with a handful of nuts and bolts, certainly the world would not end, your business would continue. Whereas if someone walked out with a bunch of the cars that you sell, that could be significantly detrimental to your business. So figure out where your risks are and put your security effort into those riskier areas first. This will get you the most bang for the buck in the shortest period of time. And then last but not least, this is counterintuitive to some folks. More responsibility should equal less access. We don't hire CEOs and CFOs for their transactional ability. We don't hire a CFO for their ability to keep payables or reconcile the bank account. We hire CEOs and CFOs to manage the business, not do transactions. So I've been involved in a number of cases where, in particular, the controller, in the cases I've been involved in, was committing fraud and stealing from the organization, and they were performing transactions very regularly. You want someone in those positions. Controller in particular is a great place to assist folks with getting a journal entry right, but I would argue they should not be performing journal entries. If a journal entry needs to be done, controller might direct someone to do a journal entry and let that person enter it, review it, get the numbers right, have someone else approve it. But I would certainly not have controllers creating and approving their own journal entries. So thinking about more responsibility equaling less access is really the way to go. As we get out of here, I mentioned that I work for FastPath. We have a number of tools that can help with some of these items, including segregation of duties, Audit Trail, those kinds of things. Last but not least, I'm the author of a bunch of books around Dynamics GP. The latest one right in the middle, the Security and Audit Field Manual. It is updated for Dynamics GP 2018, and it just covers a lot of the things that we have talked about as part of this presentation. So if you want to dig deeper, that's a great place to be. Again, lots of room for questions in the chat. So we are here to help. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be part of DynamicsCon here. And I'm looking forward to it. And I'm just really thankful that everybody's here. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to questions here. So if you've got specific questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. A couple of things that are in there. Biot made a great case that GP really should have data level security. It does not. So you're going to have to figure out how to work around. But you can do a few things maybe with organizational hierarchies to limit some of the things that people can do, but in terms of actually getting at particular kinds of data, it's pretty tough to do. You're either going to grant access to an entire window where folks could look up just about anything there or not. So I think that's an important piece to talk about. Again, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I think one of the biggest ones that I hear is around SA. I get a lot of folks who are still confused about that. And the reality is you don't need SA, you don't need DynSA. You can do it all with just a user login and adjusting their access inside of SQL Server. The beauty of that is we do get IT admins who want to argue about that a little bit, and they're kind of missing the fact that this access is passing through GP first. So once they really internalize that and maybe try and use that GP access to make a change to someone and realize they can't, they realize that GP is actually really, really secure with respect to those kinds of things. The trick is ultimately those items the change is being made at a SQL level, and you need SQL permissions to make that happen, extra SQL permissions to make that happen. So that's why there's that extra layer of security going on the SQL side. And then I think another thing that just a lot of people really get stuck with is that kind of one of those last points of more responsibility equals less access. We all seem to think that as we grow in responsibility, we should have access to more things. And when it comes to transactions, that's really not the case. And sometimes as people move up through the organization, they end up just keeping that access and taking it with them. And at some point, they need to step back even and say, I don't really need all of this access. I've met lots of CFOs and CEOs who say, I don't want any access but read only. I need to look at data, but I don't want the ability to change anything. Many of them realize, hey, that's not their expertise. That's not what they were hired to do. And even if they do have some expertise there, then they realize that's not the job, and them inserting themselves into a different job is really not the right answer for the organization. The right answer for the organization is to restrict their access. All right. Sean had made a comment earlier. I know he was joking that really everyone shouldn't be SA. The reality is we do run into this a lot. Just a couple of weeks ago, we ran into a company with 40 users and everyone was a power user. Everyone literally had access to just about everything. So even today, even after doing lots of these sessions, even after kind of years of preaching security, and as everyone has gotten better, Microsoft has gotten better in not requiring SA for things. That has been a number of years they took to make significant improvements, but they have done it. GP is considerably safer because of that. So kudos to the Microsoft team. And implementers and consultants have gotten a lot better about getting security better, avoiding everyone being power user out of the gate. So we don't see it as much, but we do still see it. If you're in that spot, I'm going to really encourage you to start moving people out of that power user role. Doesn't have to be everybody on day one, but start getting people out of that power user role. Biat also commented that the system password shouldn't really be needed. I agree. If security is set right, there's really no need for the system password. It's a bit of an anachronism there, a bit of a leftover. But we do see people who want to use it. They just want it as a little extra. So that's perfectly fine if someone wants to use it, as long as you understand the limitations of it and how best to use it, then you're fine using it. You're also perfectly fine leaving it out. It's the kind of thing that as long as security is set right, the system password probably isn't going to save you if security is set wrong, and if security is set right, you really don't need it anyway. All right. Any other questions from the group? Let's see here. Is there more information somewhere that goes into how single sign-on for GP can be implemented? Sure. So in that case, single sign-on for GP is a product. There's not anything available from Microsoft. They have said that they will not implement that at this point in time. The nature of how they've configured GP to work with SQL Server, they've chosen not to implement single sign-on. So it is only available as a product that you can purchase. We assume that folks here are smart enough to figure out if they want to purchase a product, as long as everything's appropriately disclosed. So the product is called ConfigAD. And so probably the simplest way is for you to just go and do a quick Google search on ConfigAD. Another question. Our AP account sets up vendors, maintains vendors, pay vendors, and does BankRec. When and where should we add the control? So there's a couple of different places that you can add it. I would start with adding it at the BankRec. The absolute simplest is to assign someone else the BankRec. I'm not a fan of someone just reviewing it. It's still really easy to hide something if someone is doing a BankRec review. I would put your first control at the BankRec, because that is an independent look at your accounts payable. The second place I would put it is in a payment review. Typically, folks are doing this. They have someone who actually signs the check or releases the checks. And prior to that, they will compare the invoice to the check to confirm that the invoice looks legitimate, the amounts seem reasonable, everything seems like it's appropriate along the way. So that is those are probably the two places I would start. If you have an AR team or if you have a separate team that is also doing customers, I would consider swapping those and having your AR team set up vendors and your AP team set up customers. That would probably be the next level beyond that. But if you don't have control of the bank account level, get it there. I know a lot of small business entrepreneurs, and letting go of BankRec is the absolute last thing they do. They do not want to let go of BankRec because they feel like it is their last bit of control over their cash. Let's see. Paul commented that they have a client that disabled SA 8 years ago, and once all the users were reassigned, they didn't have any issues. So again, another vote for disabling SA there. Comment that security changes with each GP release. Yes and no. The reality is they don't make a ton of security changes with each release, maybe adding a couple of things here and there for new features. Wholesale changes are really small. The groups essentially don't change. We're not huge fans of the groups that Microsoft puts out. We would recommend that you build your own, but either way, the groups don't change a ton. So most folks, once you get your security right, it tends to stay right. So a question from Marco: does FastPath provide clients with a tool that management can utilize for security? We do. We have a couple of tools. We have one that analyzes your security and finds risks, so finds segregation of duties risks and allows you to either correct or document what you're doing with respect to those risks. So that would be our Access Risk Monitor tool. So that's available as well. Let's see if we've got any others here. Someone commented that they're using config AD with HR and Active Directory, so that if someone is disabled in HR, they get passed into GP as well and get disabled there. So just a note from a customer here. So we are down to the last couple of minutes here. So we will give folks just a second or two to see if anything else comes in. Oh yes, Beat made a comment. There is Microsoft does this. It drives everybody a little nuts, but I understand why they do this. With each new release, Microsoft does not add the security roles and tasks for the new items. Some of that is because they don't want to break stuff that people already have in place. So there's actually a script to add those with each new release. So if you want those items, that is not something that is going to come automatically with each release. It's part of the upgrade. You have to intentionally install those. They don't show up magically. So thanks, Beat, for mentioning that. Appreciate that. All right, we are at the end of the QA here, I think. So just want to say thank you again to everybody. Thanks for all of the great questions. Thanks for hanging out here in DynamicsCon. And I hope everybody has a great day hitting other sessions.